So as I said, I'm Lisa. I'm from Innovation for Agriculture, which is a knowledge exchange charity in the UK. We're one of the partners in the Disarm project. And we're ultimately a small farmer-facing charity that's all about doing farmer workshops, farm events, training, trade shows, farm demos, you name it, we try and do it, although COVID's put a slight spanner in the works. And yeah, we're all about trying to bring science and research and technology to farmers so they can adapt and translate and use that for practical application on farm. Myself specifically, why I suppose I got asked to share my experiences, I guess, in facilitation is the last few years I've spent training in this area as I've done my PhD at the University of Bristol. And this is looking at small groups of farmers, which we called farmer action groups, as they came together to discuss responsible antimicrobial use. So this is all about optimizing animal health so they don't need to rely on antibiotics, working out practical ways they could alter their practices and change farming practices so they didn't need to rely on antibiotics. There was 30 farms in total, split over 5 groups in the southwest of England. And I kind of followed them around with a dictaphone for 2 to 3 years, capturing what it was really about that approach, like how and why that really helped initiate and support changes in practice. And this is quite an important point to make at this part of the webinar, is this is really me imparting kind of experience and learning from this about how to facilitate change, not just with the farming community, but also aligned industry and advisors. I was kindly sponsored by a national levy board in the UK, HDB Dairy, who also have a large knowledge exchange interest. So the webinar is going to cover 5 facets of facilitation in quite a superficial manner, because I could spend all day talking about it. And ideally, we would have an in-person interactive meeting where you can actually practice some of the tools and techniques we're going to talk about. But unfortunately, I'm talking to you through the medium of the laptop, and it's a bit more of a training session rather than facilitation, but I'll do my best. So firstly, we're going to cover a little bit of context, the need for facilitation, why that is and where facilitation is appropriate, and then move on to what makes a good facilitator. So the roles and responsibilities. Often you'll find people say they're facilitating or try to facilitate and aren't necessarily doing it to the best ability. Then we're going to move on to the key part about understanding your group. So when you facilitate small groups, this is a really key step before you hold any kind of like event or workshop, and that's getting to know them and what they need, what they expect. And then we're going to go into some practical aspects such as planning and delivering successful workshops. And that'd be from my experience, particularly working with farmers. Hopefully gives you some tips and tricks there. And then share some more about the facilitator toolbox, as it's called, which actually is going to be part of the Disarm website. We're going to have a lot of resources on there for people to use and share as a free resource. And finally, some communication strategies, which again is quite hard to talk about communication through a webinar. But at least I can give you some starting points there. By the end of it, I hope that you will have a better understanding of the role and responsibilities of a facilitator. I'm sure many of you are either already doing facilitation in your lines of work or starting to think about it, or maybe you've only ever been facilitated. So hopefully this is going to talk to all of those different journeys, and then become equipped with tools and techniques for facilitating small groups. So that's going to be like discussion tools and communication strategies. Whenever you see this slide appear on your screen, this is an indication for you to move to the interactive activity. Now, in the meeting chat, there is a link to a mural, which is our first visual platform. And it's essentially, for those of you who don't know it, it's like a digital whiteboard that you can stick Post-it notes and write on and things. And the first question you'll see on that whiteboard is, where in the world are you joining us from? And this is kind of the first thing to really say about facilitating. Even with COVID, there are ways we can encourage participation and interact with people rather than just talking at them. And this is one tool to do that. And I'll talk a bit more about other types that we have available to us. You can be quite creative. There's you can import pictures, you can draw things and do like diagrams. And there's loads of different frameworks you can use as well. It helps me as a facilitator to get to know who's in the audience. Now, I know lots of you already through the Disarm project, although actually I haven't actually met many of you in person. But it can just help set the precedent for participation, allow people to talk, feel comfortable in the activities. Excellent. So we've got people from Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Romania, UK, Greece. Now, there's a second part to this activity. I'm going to summon you all as the organizer. I can like summon everyone to my screen, which is great. There's 3 questions now I'd like you to answer, and you can answer 1, 2, 3 on the same post-it note. And they are, what do you want to know by the end of this webinar? What do you want to be able to do by the end of the webinar? And how do you want to feel by the end of the webinar? So in terms of question 1, people got finding out what topics farmers find interesting and worth being involved in. Knowledge of new techniques. Yeah, we're definitely going to be covering that. How to convince farmers of such meetings. Yes. Then what skills people want to be able to do, increase confidence and abilities, different kinds of group work methods, knowing what methods farmers are most responsive to. Yeah. And how do people want to feel by the end of the webinar? Inspired. Good, very positive. Hopeful. Yeah. Confident. Oh, I like this one. I don't know what question this is in response to. Avoid awkwardness in facilitation. Unfortunately, you're going to have to get comfortable with awkward. Yeah, it will definitely work on your confidence. And it's one of these things where it's annoying when people say it, but you do learn on the job and you do become more confident as you use more of these techniques, and particularly getting to know your group as well. Fab, right. That's been really helpful to just understand a bit more about your expectations and requirements. Okay, so first thing I really wanted to set the scene with is the need for facilitation. So setting that context. Whenever you hear sort of innovation and knowledge support, empowering communities and people for change, bringing groups together to solve problems, develop things, cooperate and connect, there is a need for facilitation in these cases. In the sectors such as like education, design, even the corporate world, the value of a facilitator is really quite high. Whenever there's a need to put groups together to achieve an outcome, whether that's problem solving or team building, developing products and services, then facilitators are really seen to galvanize and enable that process. Otherwise, you're just putting groups of people together with possibly lots of different perspectives, ideas, agendas, and stuff might happen, but it might not happen very quickly. So there's definitely this kind of streamlining, maximizing potential that a facilitator can have. I've gone a bit cheesy and put a plant on your screen, but it's kind of a metaphor that you don't, as a facilitator, you're not dictating what kind of fruit, leaves, branches, or outside plant that's going to happen, or what kind of roots there are going to be, but you are really trying to ensure that the soil is as healthy as possible. There's plenty of air, light, space for this plant to reach its full potential. That's kind of like the metaphor of facilitation. Bringing this back to sort of agriculture and farming, we're really talking about the area of knowledge exchange, which has lots of different terms, has gone through many iterations. Traditionally, it's been practiced as agricultural extension post-World War II to increase productivity of food, and now has evolved slightly to be this more two-way exchange of knowledge and expertise between people of various perspectives and types. And it can be called co-production, co-management, transfer, transformation, mobilization. There's lots of different words to describe it that are used interchangeably, but each of them can really benefit from the role of a facilitator and trying to guide that process and bring lots of different actors together. So particularly with the Disarm project, we're talking about the multi-actor farm health teams. That really benefits from the role of a facilitator in trying to help people achieve their shared outcomes. Now, traditionally, like I said, this kind of area of work was agricultural extension, and it's still kind of practiced that way in many parts of the world, or even called that. And that's the idea of this top-down transfer of knowledge and expertise from the scientists, the research institutes who were regarded as having the only knowledge that counted, and then passing that through the field of agricultural extension to farmers who are then expected to adopt and take up that knowledge and expertise. And in some respects, that has worked and does work in some instances, but it's been shown to be limiting in lots of areas now. And the gap between the science and practice, or the technology and practice, is not getting any smaller. So that has led to the development of alternative approaches where facilitation becomes much more important. And these are bottom-up approaches, participatory, democratic, much more equitable spaces where everybody's knowledge matters and everybody can work together to achieve their shared outcomes. Now, a good example of that are stable schools, which I'm sure many of you would have heard of, and we may even have some of our Danish partners in the audience. But this was established, this kind of approach, in the early 2000s in Denmark, and it was all about reducing antibiotics for improved animal health on organic dairy farms, and involved small groups of dairy farmers meeting on each other's farms to learn off each other, this peer-to-peer learning structure. And it was based around their experiential learning by doing and being farmers. And they had facilitated discussions on their farms, and they co-created these action plans of things they were going to change. And they were deemed to be a great success. There was a 50% decrease in the mastitis rates of participant herds, and hence the antibiotic treatments, and a extensive paper detailing that there was actually no detriment to the health and welfare from participating in these groups. And the Danish government actually adopted it into the Animal Health Service, so farmers actually have a choice now. They can take part in a stable school in Denmark as part of the health service, or have their vet out more often. And that really appealed to quite a lot of organic, particularly farmers in Denmark. Now, we took this approach actually at the University of Bristol. I'm like, well, that works. Let's try it in the UK. So we adapted it for my PhD, the farmer action groups. And it was, the farmers loved it. This idea that they got to learn off their peers. They were supported in trying to change things and build up their confidence to change practices that quite often are laden with risk, meant that majority of the farms shifted away from highest priority, critically important antibiotics during this project, which was before any national regulation. And within a year of the project, every farmer changed at least one thing on their farm, with many changing many more. And really that key part of that was the mobilisation of knowledge, and ensuring that everybody's knowledge was valid. And through going through this process together as a group, increase their confidence to transform their practices, which is actually quite a key part when you're, for instance, talking about dry cow therapy, selective dry cow therapy on farms. And the kind of core part of this, like with the stable schools, was the facilitator, and called not just practically organising these groups and the logistics, but ensuring that everybody was participating and got to take part. So facilitation, as a veterinarian myself, I was not trained in this through vet school. I didn't really know much about it, so it was quite a steep learning curve for me when I started. And I could really only summarise it as getting really good at asking questions. That is going to be a bit of a theme throughout this webinar. You're going to have to get good asking questions, good questions, and at the right time. And I've just got Socrates on the screen there because I thought it was quite an appropriate quote. A question is the midwife that brings ideas to birth, which again is a bit like farming. And that can really help people reflect on their practices, open up and expand about what they're doing. And when we're, again, talking about facilitation for change here, particularly in the farming context, that can be a really powerful driver for changing practices. So what exactly is it? Now we've kind of detailed a bit about the context and why and when it's necessary, but what is it? So French-speaking audience, this will be a very familiar word for you, facile, meaning easy. You just look up in the dictionary, it literally is the process of making something easier. So there, like I said at the beginning, there's this sort of galvanization, this maximizing people's potential, making a process easier. Sessionlab.com is probably the first resource I'll direct you guys to. It's got loads of free tips and tricks on there about facilitating groups groups across lots of different sectors, and they've got a newsletter you can sign up to. They define it as the art of leading people through processes towards agreed upon objectives in a manner that encourages participation, ownership, and creativity by all those involved, which I think is quite nice. It's got some key points in there, this idea of participation and ownership. And there's quite a lot in the psychological theories when people are going through a change or having to change their ways. If it's their idea and they decide how they're going to change, quite often they stick with it better. This one's from a lady called Christine Hogan. She's got some really good manuals that I'd recommend. She's got practical facilitation here. She's got one on empowerment. They're pretty chunky, but they're like really easy reading and got loads of tips in. She describes facilitation as about helping people engage in, manage and cope creatively with the rapid changes within themselves, their communities and the globe. And if you think about it, when we're talking about whether it's antimicrobial stewardship, animal health, environmental transformation in farming, we're talking about change. We're trying to get people to navigate legislative, environmental, social changes. And that's where facilitation plays a key part. Now, got the orangutan back, interactive activity number 2. So this time we're going to go to menti.com. Okay, so you can actually see in real time the answers as well. So the first question I'd like you to answer is, what is the role of a good facilitator? And this is kind of in your opinion and experiences. What is the role of a good facilitator? And it should be able to, yep, perfect. People are adding words. You just type in your little answers and they'll pop up on the screen. Again, Mentimeter is a really good tool. I find it's like really easy to use, and you can get a free trial, which has got some basic parameters, like basic package. So it limits the amount of slides you can use, but it just adds a bit more interaction to otherwise lecture-based webinars. It's a good way of collecting data as well from large audiences. And if it's something you really like using, you can get institutional access and things. There's different like paid monthly packages. It's great. Got loads of things coming up here. So coach, motivator, guide, high profile in the topic. That's interesting. Good mediation skills, speech time for all, good listener. Yeah, we're going to come back to that, the listening part. Good conversation, empathetic, yeah, coach, connection. Yeah, lovely. That's really good. So there's lots of really good answers there. Paving the way for success. I like that. So main topic. Yeah, it's like keeping focused. Yeah, it sounds like we're all very much on the same page at this sort of galvanizing action, but also being like a good listener and empathetic. That's really good. Thanks for that. And like I say, if you have any problems with using any of these platforms, just get in touch. But everyone seems to be a whiz at it, which is great. Yeah, so this, what's on your screen now, the through Teams, is something I took from sessionlab.com, and just quite nicely demonstrates, I think, the 3 key pillars of characteristics of a good facilitator. Firstly, coach, which is something in the Disarm project we're really trying to encourage and foster in the multi-actor farm health teams. And we're trying to bring that team together to realise that the actions they want to implement to optimise animal health. So that's kind of the coach role. Catalyst is that, maximising people's potential, streamlining processes so that you get outcomes better and quicker. And conductor is quite an interesting one. I kind of think of it as an orchestral conductor rather than maybe a bus conductor, where each individual part of the orchestra is an expert in their piece of music, and delivering that, the conductor brings it all together for a showpiece, I guess. What facilitation is not, and it's quite easy, and I did this at the start of learning to facilitate, to default back to these roles. And I'm talking about these roles in a kind of more traditional sense. So it's quite easy to turn into the teacher in a workshop, or managing people, trainer as well. This is like kind of what I'm doing now as the webinar host, I guess, is being a trainer, which isn't really facilitation. And what it definitely is not is the expert. And this is quite difficult. I've experienced this in the sort of vet world, when you're paid to give advice on farm, and you've been trained to be an advisor, and you really want what's called the writing reflex, which is when you really want to help people, when you want to tell them everything you know about a subject. to help them. And that really is something you have to step away from as a facilitator. Now, it's not to say you can't be an expert and facilitate. You have to just have a sort of a gate to your expertise that can only be opened by the group. They are the ones that really request your expertise and when they want that expertise. And a real skill of a facilitator is knowing when it's appropriate to sort of give advice or give help, or even better, identifying people that the group might want to hear from to input expertise and advice. Okay, so it's a tricky line, and it's not to say external knowledge and expertise is against doing these kind of bottom-up approaches, but it should never be the default. It should always come firstly from the group's own collective knowledge and expertise. Another interactive activity, so we've got a bit of a high cluster of these. So if you go back to menti.com, question number 2, what do you think a workshop should consist of? Good brainstorm, clear objectives, getting to know each other, yeah, that's good. Interactive and practical examples over which the attendees can discuss and exchange, yeah, like that, reaching same conclusions. Active, yeah, brilliant. Cake, yep, excellent. We'll come back to the key role food can play in these kinds of approaches. Concrete, yeah, so that's the kind of concrete as in practical outputs, yeah. Conclusion summary, farmer's approach, or like that specific problem on the farm, yeah. So there's a few of you sort of have this kind of tutorial presentations part at the start, and then sort of question and answers and discussions after. Comfortable, safe, yeah. I don't think anyone's mentioned the sort of like group size. So no one was like wrong, obviously. It's just interesting to see where you're all coming from about doing a workshop. And the reason I really asked this, particularly for the disarm partners, is we're getting to that point now where we're organising and planning our events and workshops for disseminating all these innovative solutions we've been collecting. And it can help to really define what we mean by a workshop. And that might help you decide whether that's the sort of activity that you can and want to organise. So there's no real set in stone or exact definition, but generally from my experience, if you want to maximise the output of a workshop, these are kind of the key parts of them. Firstly, small groups. We're not talking 50, 100, 1,000 people events here, which turn into more kind of like exhibitions or lectures. These are small groups of people. And if I have to be pushed for a number, generally, in my experience, I'd say any less than 5 people, particularly say 5 farmers, gets a bit difficult to really increase the interactivity and the benefit that farmers can get from each other's knowledge, but not to say it's not possible. And then I probably would try and limit it to about 15 people. After that, it gets a bit difficult to facilitate everybody, particularly if you're, for instance, doing a farm walk. You have more than 15 people, you get like breakout groups, which can be quite hard to manage. But saying that, you can have a bigger group that you then purposefully have breakout groups in, so smaller workshops. That's absolutely fine. Lots of you mentioned interaction and activities and activeness. That's a key part of it. There's got to be some kind of talking and interaction and doing. It's not passive learning. And shared and agreed upon objectives or a goal. Like, what is that anticipated outcome that everybody's working towards? And then some kind of outcome of change, really. And that could just be learning and upskilling. But if you're doing a series of workshops, we might be trying to like get actual management changes on farm, for instance. People did mention having some kind of tutorial or presentations in these things. That is definitely possible. I would always just be cautious, though, that again, you don't default back to that teacher kind of mode. People say short presentation, but particularly in academia, I remember telling academics, short presentation, like 5-minute flash presentation, key points, and they you can't stop them. Go on for 20 minutes. So just be aware of that. There's definitely a point where you can insert some kind of like scene setting or talking about some data. That's fine, but try and avoid PowerPoint. We'll come back to that. Right, so the third kind of aspect of this webinar I really wanted to impress upon you all, and I'm going to spend quite a lot of time talking about this in the build up to a facilitating a workshop, is getting to know the group. Now, who is in your group? This is really key part of the facilitation, and it can really help build up rapport and trust and respect from the group so that you can reach your outcomes in a better fashion. It might be you're facilitating an already established group or a membership that already know each other. So how involved are they in that group and the setup of that group? Can you interact with them and find out what it is that group's kind of mission or idea is? Do they know each other first? Do they like each other? Do they work together? If you're a consultant facilitator going to work for a corporate world or the OIE or something, then you might be asked to facilitate a team to develop a service or a skill. It's really important at that point to know the hierarchy and the tensions and relationships in that group if you're going to really maximize their potential and not put people off. If there's someone in the group that everybody hates, then that needs to kind of be acknowledged. In terms of knowledge exchange and farming, it's a good question to ask, what do they already know about the topic? It seems obvious, but it's quite often forgotten to do. For instance, if you wanted to hold some workshops on precision livestock farming and how that can help manage animal health and reduce antibiotic use, and you've got an open invitation to lots of different farmers in an area, I'd be really interested to know who's already doing precision livestock farming techniques. What kind of technology are they already using? What do they think about that? And then you can use that information to build up your agenda about what you're going to do in your workshop, and it will help the people that you invite and who participate will feel listened to and valued in that workshop already. And another kind of, I'm doing dramatic examples here, but what do the group care about? We know that antimicrobial resistance is a major threat to human and animal health, and we care a lot about it. But if you're trying to recruit and engage farmers to a workshop that are suffering from a drought, for instance, there's a kind of priority shift that is worth being aware of. And some of the workshops I've held online in recent months have been around like animal welfare, but I've been quite conscious that we're going through the greatest pandemic in living history. So I have built that into the workshop content. So it's trying to, make it as relevant as possible. Ultimately, just ask the group, phone them up, visit them on farm, visit the practices and advisors, and ask what are their expectations from being in such a workshop, and do they align with what you want to achieve facilitating that. In the sort of facilitation chat, that's known as a needs analysis, basically finding out about your group before you start. It's not always easy to do, like for instance, like an online thing like this, where you might not be sure who's going to join. It can be hard, and that's totally acceptable, and that's probably where your interactive activities at the start of meetings can really help. But if you're doing in person, and particularly a series of workshops, you could focus that first workshop on really getting to know people and what they would like to know about, what they already know, and the direction they want to take it. And that really is talking to that participatory bottom-up ethos of the people in that group really directing kind of trajectory of the workshops. Because we're doing all this online, I did want to just highlight some of the ways you could interact with your audience. So obviously we've already used Mural and Mentimeter, but there's also Pinup, which is a really basic like cork board or notice board interface. There are limits on how many people you can use to interact. There's Klaxon as well. I've not got as much experience using that one, but people who I know use it love it. And then just being a bit more inventive with your chat functions, just round the room intros. I tend to have a kind of cut off of about 12, 13 people that you can just go around the room, the virtual room, asking people, where you're from, why did you come along today, and what do you want to get out of the workshop? So pretty simple. Zoom has breakout rooms as well, which I've been involved in those, but you do need more facilitation actually at that point, because you need someone in all the breakout rooms. which can be quite difficult. Right, so we haven't even got to the workshop yet, still on planning. So you've made efforts to connect with potential participants in the workshop, or the people you know you're going to recruit and engage with, and you've been informed by what they already know, want to know and expect. And this will really detail what is going to be the purpose of the workshop, what it is you want this workshop to achieve. And they're key questions to really get straight in your head and can be really quite difficult to answer. If the purpose of the work is just to learn more about precision livestock farming, that's all well and good, but I would urge you to be a bit more specific. What exactly, what learning objectives do you want, and drill into that, and that can be guided by what your group really want to know. And then think about what sort of experience you want the group to have. Do you want it to be very hands-off? They really work as a peer group and have a bit of a social chat. That can be really effective, particularly if we're trying to initiate and encourage change about practices that might be a bit risk laden. Or do you want it to be a bit more structured action planning, a bit more hands-on? I have a kind of 3-step thing I do when I'm planning a workshop, and I go through this sort of checklist of what am I doing? What is the purpose and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve at this workshop? How are you going to achieve that? So what kind of processes and tools and techniques you're going to use, which we'll come to in a second. Who's going to be involved? You can have small groups, big groups, which people are involved. Practically, when is this going to happen? Where? And where is a key thing. If you're going to do it on farm, obviously try and go to that farm beforehand, visit the farmer, talk about things like refreshments, parking, energy requirements like electricity, and you can get those things sorted. It just makes the workshop a bit more flawless. And then the last two I think about, which maybe come in from more of a research angle, but effectiveness. How are you going to know that the workshop's been successful? Are you going to collect data? What kind of data are you going to collect? Do you need to collect the data? And we've been talking about this in Disarm, obviously, about impact. This is something we really, I don't have the answers to this, but this is probably some of the areas we need to think about. How are we going to know this workshop has really helped people change? What kind of impact has it had? We might not be necessarily wanting impact, we just want to know what kind of impact it has. And then follow up. You might just be holding a one-off workshop with one group of people that there's no need to come back together. But I'd urge you to think about, could you have a follow-up workshop 6 months later, a year later, to really revisit what it is that farmers or advisors have implemented since being facilitated in a workshop. And I'll send this round afterwards, but I have a little agenda that I do with the farmer, which is just a few columns on a table with the timings, which are broken down into 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And then what we're going to do. So it might just be the welcome, the different activities, how that's going to work, who's going to be involved, and what resources I need. And then I just have that on one A4 sheet of paper with me at the workshop, so I can refer back to. Consulting stakeholders. So if you're trying to do some workshops where you want to reach out to a veterinary practices farming clientele, really engage with those vets, because they're kind of the gatekeepers to that community, and they all have a very interesting perspective about how things could work, what the outcomes could be. And then finally, share that agenda beforehand with the group who are going to be participating. Not always necessary, and it might not get looked at, but if you're trying to deal with some tricky scenarios, particularly if there's some difficult questions, it can just give people that time to prepare beforehand. Now, this is a busy slide, but I know particularly with my accent, it can be quite difficult to understand me. So I thought I would just get some of the key points on the screen. This is how I would organise a workshop with farmers specifically. And it obviously there's no set exact way of doing it, and you can be more hands off or more involved. It depends what your purpose and outcomes are. But I generally split it into beginning, middle and end, pretty obvious. And these are the parts to it. So welcome section, so everybody feels at ease, they all understand why they're there and they're not at the wrong meeting or with the wrong expectations. And then this is where I would probably instigate some ground rules, which is probably more important with new groups or groups that don't know each other so well. But it's usually a few sentences where we talk about confidentiality, So what's shared in the discussions stays in the discussions, treating everybody with respect. Everybody's opinion is valid. And then just making them aware that if you are dominating discussion, interrupting people, then myself as the facilitator will ask you to be quiet and have a little rest. Please don't be offended. And just having that written down somewhere can be really good, to just so people know what the feeling or the ethos of the workshop is going to be. And I've had feedback from more quiet members of groups who've liked that, because they've been worried certain characters will dominate discussion, and that really does put, in the farming world at least, that puts a lot of people off discussion groups. So it's good to start with that. And then you can go into like the agenda, so everybody knows what's going to happen over the course of the workshop, particularly highlighting coffee breaks and lunch times. And then you can go into the introductions. It could be simple, just round the room like we discussed earlier, or you can get creative. And I've used things like, particularly when you've got national audiences or international audiences, you get people to stand up and stand in different parts of the room with a poster indicating where they are from in the world, or where they are from in the country. Or another one that's usually gets quite a lot of sniggers is everybody lines up from one end to the other, indicating the years of experience they've got in, say, farming. That could be quite good if you've got a mixed bunch of farmers. And you can also use the objective setting for the workshop, deciding what people want to achieve as an icebreaker. And there's loads of resources out there for like activities and games and things. And this is just one example that's got loads of like tools you can use to give you a bit of inspiration if you're lacking it. And I think if you're working with a group, the same group over time, so a series of workshops, then it helps to be a bit more imaginative, because it keeps the group interested. And then you move into the middle section, and this is where you might introduce some tutorials or presentations if you really feel that's necessary. But I really urge you, keep them super short, minimal amounts of information, and put yourself in the group's shoes. What you've already done your research about who's in the group, what they already know, what they don't know. Don't go high level load and saturate people, and try not to use PowerPoint. If you're doing workshops on farms, that's probably going to be limited anyway, but flip chart paper, whiteboards, much better. Getting people to come up and draw things and interact is much more in the style of facilitating a workshop. And then you can go into sort of the main activities and discussions, and I've got some tips and tools to talk about here that can help that. And really, if you're going to do a farm walk, that comes into that section as well, that middle section. And then I'd have a summary activity at the end, where I often ask someone in the group, a volunteer in the group, to summarise what's been discussed, some of the outputs, how that's met, some of the anticipated outcomes, and then we wrap up the session. And sometimes you know you've done a good workshop if you can't actually get people to leave. But that might just help people who are particularly new to this, who haven't really done workshops before. It's just a structured planning tool to help. Now, some of the nuts and bolts of how do you facilitate. Now, this is something that is quite hard to get across on the webinar, and I often do like role play with people to practice some of these communication strategies. But like I said at the start, my summary of facilitation is really getting good at asking questions. And the first thing there is open-ended questions. So if you can answer yes or no to your question, probably not the best one to start with, or to start a discussion off, because you just get no, and then that'll be the end of it. So open-ended questions. Tell me about this, or how do you feel about that, or what did you do when? Lots of open-ended questions, but I often call them conversation grenades. You can be a little bit controversial and throw in a controversial subject. So in the UK, if you want to really start off a farming group, talk about TB, bovine tuberculosis. That is sure, if you're on a cattle farming, that is talking about. Then I call them prod and poke questions. They've got more technical terms, but these are questions such as, could you tell us a bit more about how you're treating lame cows? Apologise for the pig and poultry people out there. My area of expertise is more cattle. Or you might say, why do you get so stressed out about managing lameness? So you're really like getting the person to think a bit harder about what they're saying, about their thoughts about the matter, the meaning behind that, rather than just practically what they're doing. And you'll be surprised at how much that sparks conversation and speaks to possibly other farmers in the room. Also, if you're finding that the person who's talking kind of dries up or stops and conversation seems to be falling away, you can start throwing it out to the group. So be like, well, what does everyone else think about that subject? Or if you're out on a farm walk, you'd be like, what does everyone else think about this shed or this barn? You could say, like, and it just widens it out and invites invitation from other people. So there are some tactics for asking questions. The next bit, which I found one of the hardest things as a vet being trained in facilitation, was active listening. This is a bit of a skill that, you know, some of you will probably find it really easy. Others, it might take a bit more practice. But this is the idea that you kind of let the person know that you're listening to them through different sort of communication strategies, and you have to get really comfortable with silence. So when you're talking, if someone's silent listening to you, that's actually perceived as quite a good sign. It's not that they're not interested. If someone keeps interrupting you to try and, oh, well, have you tried this or have you tried that? That's not active listening. So some of the ways you could let them know you're listening is reflecting back what they've said. So they might be talking about managing lameness in dairy cows, and you say, oh, I can see you're really you've said that really stresses you out, managing lameness, and you hate having to trim cows' feet. And then the person will respond and maybe elaborate further. You can affirm what they've said as well, being like, oh, it sounds like you're really good at trimming cows' feet. And that often gets a really good reaction as well. Or you just summarize or paraphrase what people have said. And that often checks in with the group as well to make sure that you understand them, and then they really feel that you're respecting their conversation. So that's just a few tips. And I've got a sheet of PDF of tips and tricks you can use, and it's something you could like practice a couple at your next workshop just to see how it goes and the reaction you get. But ultimately, I just wanted to highlight facilitation is all about humility, curiosity, and patience. The patience being enjoy silence and enjoy just letting the group lead the discussion, and things don't happen instantly. Curiosity is asking questions, being curious about what people are doing, and humility is accepting that you don't have all the answers, and you can't know everything. And it's not a bad thing in a group, particularly in the fields we work in, to say, not sure about that, I'll have to come back to you next time, or I'll follow it up. And that can earn, again, a lot of respect with the group, which really help build your rapport and help the group reach full potential. One of the key things I got taught by my colleague doing the farm action groups was no one knows a farm better than a farmer, and especially their farm. So yes, we all in this audience have a wealth of experience about lots of different things, and that can be complementary and will be complementary to farmers' knowledge. But if you take that stance, it really will help encourage that participatory, bottom-up ethos for initiating and supporting change on farm. Right, to finally wrap up, I'm going to talk about some practical things you can do in specifically farm workshops, which is more my kind of realm of expertise, I guess. If you can hold a workshop on a farm, do. And I accept, particularly for those working in the pig and poultry industry, this can be tricky with all the biosecurity measures and, you know, going to someone else's farm and then not being able to go back to their own farm. But there can be ways around it. And I do know some pig advisors and farmers do like virtual video farm walks, and then they meet somewhere else. So that's where going back to those interactive online tools can be helpful. And you can still do all the group discussion activities in person, just not on farm. But if you're working with farmers, the farm is their like the comfort zone, the place they know. That is really where you're going to get people to be at ease. Doing it in a pub can be helpful, which is where that top picture is, and when you've got inclement weather, as shown in that bottom picture, sometimes you have to do it indoors. If you're not sure about the practicalities of a workshop, like when to do it and where, ask the group. When do they want to meet? Never assume. I think involving food is a good way. Maybe that's just because I like food, but it's quite a social activity, as a point of conversation. And in farming, you know, the dairy farmers I worked with, what milk I bought to the meetings became quite an interesting point of discussion. So you can use it to your advantage. This has probably become more appropriate now with COVID, but inviting local farms. Now, one of the key things about stable schools and the farmer action groups was those groups who met at regular intervals for a long period were all local to each other. And that really helps with continued engagement because they're not travel so far, but also it's becoming more relevant with COVID. We might have to keep things much more geographically close. But then you can start opening it up by saying, well, you guys are interested in being in this workshop, farmers, advisors, whoever, ask them to bring a friend. You can't participate until you come with someone else. And that's really, in social science, is actually called sort of chains of referral or snowballing, where people invite their own networks to meetings. And again, understanding your group would be good to know the dynamics between who they advise or who they don't advise, don't invite. So that can always be interesting. And in my experience, keeping workshops to less than 3 hours was kind of best, particularly if you're doing it in the middle of the day. Again, it depends. If you're doing a series of workshops, they can afford to be a bit shorter and snappier. But maybe if you're doing a one-off, there might be a bit of flexibility there. Hopefully that's given you some pointers. Now, the group discussion tools. This was really fun developing these. And I've already talked about icebreakers and how you can be a bit more imaginative with introductory activities. On your screen are just some examples of what we developed in the Farmer Action Group project. So top left is some farmers ranking areas of a farm. They've just been around on a farm walk. Each of those bowls represents a different part of that farm. They're labelled. And then the balls were pink and red for opportunities for change. I didn't say negatives. And green and blue for like strong points, you know, strengths that people wanted to celebrate. So farmers would come in and they'd rank it, and the host farm could then see nice and visually things they were doing really well, and then the areas that we probably should focus on to develop an action plan as a group. And they all kind of follow a similar tactic, really. So the screen on the picture on your right, top right, that's a similar idea with different areas of the farm and different management areas. And then each farmer would have a little piece of paper that they would score anonymously the areas, 1 to 10. And then I'd collect those up and have to do some mental maths, which was highly stressful. But then you'd see the highest and lowest scoring areas of that farm. Once you added everybody's scores up. So that, again, for the host farm, is a critical process. But in this project, everybody was going through the same process, and it really helped drill into exactly what practices people could change, kept it driven, kept it like motivated, which goes back to this is your role as a facilitator, is trying to help people achieve their outcomes. And if you've got these tools available to you to do that, then great, you're on to winning succession then. You can do card sorting, which is that bottom left-hand corner where you might have some categories. This is just, we were evaluating each group's action plan as a group and then deciding what had been successful, what hadn't, what was just disregarded. So that can help people explain then. You can ask them, so they put something in the disaster box and you'd be like, do you want to tell us a bit about that? Or why was that? Or how did that make you feel? Or what does that mean for your farm? What are you going to do next? These sort of questions. And then the favourite one, which some farmers obviously didn't quite like, but some farmers loved it, was getting a volunteer in the group to draw the farm walk they'd just been on, or draw their farm or an ideal farm. And this was actually in New Zealand, so this is a bit of a cheat, but they drew the farm that they were on, that had come from, and all the pinch points for lameness in dairy cows, all the like problem points. And then they discussed as a group what measures they could put in place really to like mitigate those risks. So again, I'll try and put all this in a PDF for you and share it round. It might even be an article actually somewhere, which still needs to be published. And then really the thing that everyone loves doing at workshops is getting feedback. I hate feedback, but there's lots of different ways you can do this, and it depends on kind of the project or what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to capture who's attended and the impact, it gets really tricky, because people could say they've learned a lot and they now know this and they are going to change that. But these are all intentions to change or intentions to do something, which is not a very strong measure of impact. And this is why it goes back to the idea that if you can factor in follow-up workshops, so like bringing the group back together, or just following up people individually, then after a period of time, that can be a better way to capture feedback and impact. But if you do have to do something, you just want to know if you've hit the target with your workshop, you can create a bullseye chart somewhere on the farm at the meeting, and as people leave, they can put a sticker, maybe not an arrow, on the area to indicate whether they thought it was good or not. So that's a bit of quick. It's a bit like when you're at an airport and you've got the smiley face, grumpy face, you're not really sure what it means. You do something like that. Right, so that's basically the webinar complete. So here's a summary slide, just indicating the 5 facets of facilitation and planning and delivering successful workshops. Hopefully that's equipped you with some tools and techniques, or giving you a taster or idea of what you can do in your own lines of work. If you're already on that journey of facilitation and doing workshops, maybe this can add a bit of inspiration. But if you're maybe more at the start and you've never facilitated before, hopefully this is giving you a bit of context really about what it actually is, what it can be, and taking those steps to understand who you facilitate. The final bit, just because I'm adamant I'm going to make this interactive, we've got a interactive part for the question and answers. So if there has been any questions in the team chat, Laura and Frederick will feed them back to me, but you've also got an opportunity to go back to Mentimeter and file up a question or contribute questions through that. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that you found that interesting or useful in some respects. Obviously got quite a wide range of people, so I have to speak to everybody's interests. But thank you, and over to you guys for questions.
I read the article on stable schools in Denmark, and in that procedure, people had to wait their turn to speak and advise a hosting farmer. But I was wondering, do you agree with this approach, or would you rather keep it a vivid discussion that people can directly pick in on each other and have a vivid discussion rather than a tour that is proposed that people have to wait for their turn or not? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, good question. The facilitation in the stable schools was quite regimented, but that really was focusing on every farmer having the chance to recommend something for the action plan. So that's why they went round in sequence, being like, "What's your recommendation? What's your recommendation?" I mean, that's quite a good idea, I think, because then it ensures everybody's got a chance to recommend, even if they're quiet or shy. But if you don't, you just say, "Well, I haven't got any ideas." That's fine. They still had quite a lot of discussion on the farm walks they did, so that was a bit more freestyle. But the facilitator was less involved in the kind of process in the stable schools compared to the farmer action groups. So myself, I was much more involved in the presentation of benchmarking data with the farmer action groups, a lot less discussion structure. Really, the outcome really was you can't leave until we've got something on the action plan. So it was a bit more, I was more of a participant than they were in the stable schools. But again, it depends on your group, what you're trying to achieve, your own personality as well.
Mm-hmm.
I
have one more, if I can. What's your advice in our disarm farm visits for work package 4 to invite the advisors and veterinarians as well, or just keep it farmers? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah. Ideally, with the disarm, because of the multi-actor approach and the fact that it is a team, I think everybody, as many people as possible, should be involved, and that includes like all the farm workers and the family, the cubicle scrapers to the delivery drivers, and ideally that would be what you have, and all the advisors. With the farmer action groups, because it was quite a research setting, and there was a lot of politics around trying to get the vets involved due to when the meetings were, consistent participation from vets and concerns from other vets about neighbouring practices being involved, and a bit of a reluctance at the time for vets to encourage reduction in antimicrobial use, believe it or not. It was decided we wouldn't include them. But I think if you're really trying to help farmers transform their practices, there might be a need for just farmer meetings where there's no other sort of dominating experts that they're not going to sort of default to. Or if there's a group that who are unsure of the approach and don't really maybe value their own expertise, then you've kind of got to talk to them about, well, would you like to start where you have got your advisors there and you've got people who can input expert knowledge, and then move to more just farmers on their own? So there's no set way, and you have to this is why I emphasize going back to knowing your group and really deciding with them what the purpose and outcomes should be, and be flexible between them, really. It's got a question from Stellian. In Romania, do the workshops have to be only in dairy farms? No, not at all. There were my examples, because that's more my experience. I'd go for all sectors, all types of farms. If you're working with pig and poultry, you might be limited to only doing outdoor pig and poultry units, possibly, because of biosecurity. But no, all sectors. And even we've discussed Innovation for Agriculture having, workshops on biosecurity with cattle farmers, dairy and beef, because there's a bit of a crossover, and then inviting poultry farmers or inviting pig farmers, and this is what Disarm's great for, there's that cross-sector learning that can be had. So you don't have to keep it all to the same type of farm. I'd encourage you to sort of explore doing lots of different options. And if you're just doing a workshop and it's open for anyone to join, you might find you'll get a mixture of different farm types, and different people will be happy to host. But you definitely can go outside of dairy to do this.
Yeah, hello. My question is, as facilitator, can we expose existing theoretic solutions and let participants discuss about it, about the effectiveness on this specific farm, or is it considered teaching?
You mean so farmers criticising other farms? Is that? Sorry, the sound quality is not great, so you might have to repeat. If you're worried that, say, it's getting a bit tense, or people are speaking impolitely or out of turn, then as a facilitator, you should step in and be like, remind people of the ground rules. But generally, I found farmers are really, because they're just all in the same boat, isn't it? They're all doing the same kind of job. They're actually really quite respectful of each other. I've done less of this with advisors, particularly like maybe different vet practices, so that issue might come up maybe a bit more then. But I suppose if you're worried about critiquing, it's going back to those managing expectations and those ground rules.
My question was about really the role of the facilitator. Can we expose some solutions, or is it the role of only the participants?
Sorry, yeah, got you there. Yes, you can. You definitely can. I would always, if you kind of on the tip of your tongue, you know what the solution should be, or have a good idea of what it could be, and the group aren't really coming to that discussion, then it's kind of your job to try and kind of lead them that way. But you could also ask the group, do you want to hear what I think? Or they may ask you what you think. So that's one way around it. Or, for example, you might be talking about, I don't know, whether to be a closed herd, for instance. And you know all the benefits that people should really be a closed herd, and everyone's been like, no, I don't think it should be a closed herd. You could ask the group, well, why do you think that? What do you think the disadvantages of being a closed herd are? And you kind of lead them through the process of trying to come to the solution so that it should be a closed herd. Does that make sense? So there's like, you can take the slow process and try and ask, and this goes back to asking really good questions of the group so that they then start seeing your way of thinking, or you can ask permission to insert what you think, but phrase it as if, well, if I was farming here, I think I would do this because of these reasons. If that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so basically, I think thank you so much for your presentation, by the way. I really would like to know more about it, and I have a lot of questions, but I think one of the things that I find more difficult, just in general, is when you're when you're somewhat of a younger scientist, or when you're more academically inclined, or when you mostly have an academic career, when you approach a lot of farmers, I feel that there's usually a lot of resistance in that, initial, also because there's a certain anti-scientific movement going on, it seems. So how do you deal with farmers that are skeptical about the advice that you're giving? And how did they create a lot of objections just, off the bat? They just kind of initiate the conversation, but already with that stand of like, I don't really believe what you're saying. And I'm sure you have a lot of experiences on that. So, yeah. So how do you see that? And then on another level is once you have a group of farmers that are engaged, and that's really great. Like say the first people that they are taking whatever measures, they're the first step. Those are the easy, let's say the low hanging tree. But how do you reach the higher fruit? How do you get the people that are less engaged in change? How do you get them to participate in these workshops to start with?
Yeah, that is a big question, or elephant in the room. So the first thing I'll say, which will answer both your bits of the question, I think, is engaging with your what's called the gatekeepers, or influential community members, or in New Zealand they call them like farmers with mana, which is like a Maori word. And it's people that the community you're trying to engage with already respect, already have relationships with, and it's those people you want to work with to try and build up a relationship with the community you're trying to engage with. So for me in the farmer action groups, that was firstly the vets, which didn't actually turn out so well. There should be a paper about that soon. And the second one was actually AHDB Dairy, who are the National Levy Board in the UK. And I worked really closely with a lady called Sarah Bolt, who's a brilliant facilitator, and I learned lots from her. And she already had her networks from being a knowledge exchange manager at the Levy Board. And people got an invite for an event from her. They're like, we know her, going to go to that. So that's a thing I would really encourage you to do, is those stakeholders, those gatekeepers, really engage them and get them on side and help you with that. And doing initial meetings and workshops with them. That will help firstly. Second of all, it's interesting you say, because there's a bit of a split, isn't it? There's the anti-science, or you're an academic, what do you know? You don't know anything practical. But then there's also, you're a university, you're impartial, you're neutral, supposedly. Neutral, as opposed to like, a company selling something. And that's the thing you really need to hammer home, really. And farmers that I've worked with have actually quite liked the fact that I'm not trying to sell anything. Even vets, I'll talk again because it's my experience, but vets, we're all trying to sell something. So the fact that University of Bristol, who I was associated with the farmer action groups, we're an impartial, neutral. We're just trying to understand how this works. We're trying to do this for you guys to be a benefit. So use that angle. If they want to really engage controversially with some of the things you're saying, I would go with the flow with that, because the fact that they're engaging with you, questioning you, that's really good. And that's where you can start doing the active listening, like summarizing what they're saying, paraphrasing what they're saying, reflecting back their things. And they've shown this with, so a lot of these techniques using motivational interviewing as well, which is used with people with really severe addictions and like smoking, drugs, and stuff like that. And the power of affirming what people say and reflecting back to them, it does, like, you hear something you said back and then you disagree with it. So if you say, oh, you use a smoking example, or you won't quit smoking because you find it's really like a comfort to you, and then you see people go, well, actually, maybe I should, and it's some weird psychological process that I'm not fully understanding, but trying to do that. So, and with the anti-vax campaign, they've tried, doing that kind of active listening, affirmations, reflections back to people, because if you just give more information, and we're geared to do that, we're geared to do the writing reflex. So here's all the reasons why you should vaccinate. It does this, it does this, this. And you're talking to a mother who's like absolutely terrified about their child being turned into a pincushion, for instance. You're never going to agree just by giving it more information. So you've got to listen to their concerns, and then that's the start of the process of being re-ingratiated. That helps.
Yeah, that helps a lot. That helps a lot. And actually, what you just called it, a motivational interview. Well, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's loads of peer-reviewed papers on it as well. The guys that came up with it is Stephen Rolnick, I think, and I've forgotten the name of the other one. I'll send you some links.
Yeah, actually, there was also in the Mentimeter, there were some people asking in the bottom links we can go for resources, ideas to warm up activities, workshop design. Yeah, because actually, in my experience with different types of meetings, I find that this warming up is very important to get the people comfortable and get their ideas, also in their creativity, and then a lot of people have to overcome some sort of shyness, even when they know each other. They don't want to be the ones that are, first deviating from the group by asking questions. Even asking a question can be a way of deviating from the group if everybody's quiet. So
exactly.
So is there ideas there?
Yeah, and this goes back to knowing your group and what if they're going to be a bit more shy or reserved around certain people, and to think, would they be more open if the advisors weren't there, for instance, or maybe they'd be more confident if their advisor was there. Ultimately, you just ask people. Never make any assumptions about how comfortable someone might be. Just ask. And it was I followed up loads of not loads, but some farmers that dropped out or didn't participate in farm action groups. I thought that's going to be interesting. And once they opened up about it was like a treasure trove of findings, and their feelings about working with other farmers, for instance. So I'd encourage you just to ask those questions before your workshop to find out what people are comfortable with. I didn't mention it, actually, I forgot, but I started off a lot of these group discussion tools with just sticky notes that people would write on and stick on a wall. And then was like, nah, people don't like writing. Or illiteracy. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but we've got quite a substantial illiterate farming population, actually, that is hidden because it's embarrassing. So people don't force people to do anything they don't want to do. Hence why I went down ping pong balls, drawing, asking volunteers. And then as you can get more adventurous, I guess, the more you go on with a certain group, because they build rapport. And sometimes people are just quite happy not asking, and not speaking out. They'll sit there back and listen. And that's a really hard thing. You can't, as a body language and just knowing people, whether you think that someone's an introvert because they don't want, that they're just not happy putting themselves out there and their opinion out there, but they're not shy. So there's those people, they're just introverted, don't express themselves all the time. And then there's those that are actually genuinely shy about speaking out in public. So yeah, that's a hard to just tell you how to do that. It's a practice thing, I think, and knowing people. I'm sure you'll get, I hate to say vibes, but body language and things like that will help.
So I guess just to finalize my point, would you say that if you are approaching a mixed group of farmers, so let's say, for instance, when we're having the farmers from different countries meeting each other, which we hope it will happen, how do you circumvent this problem, as a facilitator, because you're going to have to interact with culture that is not your own. So I suppose you would have to at least also make that clear in the ground rules that there is a level of culture and a level of sensitivity to other body language and etc. that you might miss. I don't know how you, what kind of intercultural, facilitation you had in mind for that.
Yeah, well, I think you've answered the question quite nicely there. The ground rules will become very helpful in all languages to help facilitate that. And I probably, when you're working with other cultures, the kind of recommendations, and Christine Hogan actually talked about this a lot, is to spend a lot of time getting to know that culture beforehand, which with our cross-exchange visits is not possible. So I would go for, so say like Stellian, I'll pick on you because you're on my screen. So say we do our like Romania, UK cross-exchange. I would probably encourage you to facilitate the Romanian farmers and I'd facilitate the UK farmers, and we would work together to try and exchange those topics, because there'll be a language barrier first and foremost, and then there's going to be a translation issue, because I think it will be easier for people to speak in their own language at these events, and then for the facilitators to be also translators. And that, when I've gone to the Netherlands on farm tours, that's generally what's happened, and it's been quite successful. It's not the same, you don't get the same kind of peer-to-peer from farmers, but in a cross-exchange visit that's a one-off workshop, you're going to be quite limited about the peer-to-peer learning anyway. So there's being realistic what you can achieve, and managing expectations, and allowing, if there was, say, I don't know, there might be a UK farm that has some Romanian workers that can speak Romanian, which would be amazing, because then we can they could come with us, and also help with the translation. But yeah, you've got language first and foremost, and then culturally just being aware that there's differences, and things will be a bit slower. You have to factor that in when you're doing like a planning a workshop and you've got different cultures and languages. That adds like another hour.
Sandija asks if if you would recommend a mix of groups with farmers in respect to the size of the farm, organic, non-organic, etc.
Groups, okay, yeah, yes, I would. Again, from my experience doing these farmer action groups, because I was worried we wouldn't actually recruit any farms, I was just like, right, anyone can join. They can be organic, conventional, large, small, family farm business, anything. And only 30 farms, so by no means representative, however, quite illustrative of UK farming. We literally had every kind of system that you commonly get, from 600, 700 cows right down to a 60 cow herd. We had a couple of organics, although I was kind of more interested in how conventional farms worked with this approach. Like one person farms to multi-staffed teams. So, and that was a key benefit for a lot of farmers in the project. Not all of them, but they quite liked going to like a high yielding indoor reared herd, loved going to a spring block 5,000 litre herd, because you get totally different reactions and perspectives that they weren't normally getting. And they had a commonality which linked them all, which was antibiotic use. They were all using antibiotics, misusing and excessive in some respects. So if you can find a commonality between different systems, then yes, I'd encourage them all to get involved. Particularly organic, non-organic. There's a lot to be learned between the two of those. I think conventional farming can, learn a lot from organic principles. Sometimes you might find some groups that you work with and what they want to know is very sector specific or system specific. Again, ask the group, think about what your purpose is, your anticipated outcomes, what people expect, and then that might help with your answer. So from my experience in workshops, the best approach is always to mix different expertise clusters as much as possible in the discussion tables, including different types of farming production. Oh yeah, good. So it's the reaction you get. If you always get high yielding dairy herds going to high yielding dairy herds, they're never going to pick up practices from like an extensive grazing system, which may be beneficial. Or like biosecurity, that example I gave earlier, isn't it? The pig and poultry sectors are miles ahead, at least in the UK, to cattle production when it comes to biosecurity. So surely there's things they could pick up and learn.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I also, in my PhD, was speaking to a farmer who was involved in the LEAF scheme, which he was quite positive about that because he was talking about how it made him think about farming. And in fact, they went beyond just visiting other types of farms. But he said that one really interesting visit was to a Nissan car factory and the way that they would buy things for the day that they needed it, and he was comparing that to buying his feed in advance because apparently it was a good deal, and then the prices changed, and by the time he actually needed that feed it would have been cheaper to buy it later on in the year anyway. So yeah, it's really possible to think outside the box with these things.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. It's that kind of interdisciplinary working is essentially the same idea, isn't it? Is bringing the expertise into lots of different disciplines to understand each other's disciplines. And there was a really good talk I saw from someone, I can't remember what his name, I think he was involved in some kind of behaviour change in a corporate consultancy and trying to get a whole company to like instigate hand washing and things like this. And he used the example of a heart specialist hospital, so people that do lots of heart operations in London, were having loads of fatalities, issues with recovery, like post-operational infections, like not good stuff. And the surgeons were like working back to back on 16-hour operations. Everyone was working really hard. But there was something going wrong in the chain of the heart operation procedures, and they were really struggling to find out how they could make that resolve that issue. And one surgeon went home one night after a really long shift and sat down in front of the TV and turned the TV on, and Formula One came on. And he was watching it, and they was watching the changeover they do. I mean, I don't really know anything about Formula One, but the changeover of car wheels and stuff in the little stop pit. And he was amazed at how efficient that process was. I was like, maybe our staff changeover in the hospital is where we're going wrong, because this is where the communication and transfer of information happens. So he phoned up Formula One and got their like car changeover people to come and visit the hospital and reviewed the staff changeover of this like specialist heart hospital in London to find out whether that was where they were having issues. And it was a major success, and they apparently improved all their hospital post-surgery infections and the like, just because they kind of like looked at another field, like the hospital sector, looking at the Formula One sector, which I thought was interesting. I've gone a bit off tangent now. But also got a question on Mentimeter. How should you deal with farmers that are very sceptical about the advice you were giving, or create a lot of objections about the changes proposed? Can you share some experiences? Yeah, that's quite a bit similar to Helena's question. Ideally, you won't be given that much advice. You're trying to facilitate the knowledge and expertise already in that group of farmers or group of advisors or that group. And ideally, the advice you give will be at the request of the group, or when it becomes obvious that there's a gap in the group's knowledge. So if they create a lot of objections to the changes proposed, that's probably because you've been coming in top down with your advice, I would argue. I'm not sure who answered that and if that answers the question, but really try and it's going back to those communication strategies of asking the group what they think, and maybe in the guidelines or when you formulate these groups or establish groups for a workshop, you make it explicit that you're not there as an advisor, you're there as the facilitator, and it's their knowledge, their perspectives and ideas that is going to be the solutions to what the outcomes. If they need knowledge, you can input it, but it should be at their request, and that will avoid, oh, stop telling us what to do idea. How to reach farmers that are less engaged, how to activate them to get involved without being pushy. Yeah, so the less engaged farmers, yeah, this is an interesting one. So who are these less engaged farmers, isn't it? Because it depends what they're engaging with. So I always wonder, the farms that maybe vets think are not very good, not very engaged, not very proactive, might be super engaged with their like grassland discussion group, or I don't know, their milk buying boards or something. So it really does depend how you engage with them for a start, and are they always the same farmers? Make use of the gatekeepers. Who do these people trust and value? What sort of information and knowledge pathways do they trust and value? So that can help bring out the scope. And also, I didn't really make much of a point of this, but when you're thinking about who's in your group and the purpose of your workshop, ask yourself, what benefit does a farmer or whoever you're inviting get from participating in a workshop? What benefit do they get? Or what's in it for them? And if all you can say is more knowledge, then you're only going to reach those that are interested in that subject at that time and need to know a little bit more about it. When I drilled into who was in the farmer action groups, lots of them were joining not just because they liked discussion groups, not just because they were interested in antimicrobial use, but they were worried about public perception of dairy farming. Some of them had milk contracts that were stipulating they had to reduce use, avoid HPCIAs, and they saw this project as a way of helping them achieve that. So others, there was a couple who were seemingly altruistic and were just like, we want to share what we know. So there was quite a lot of varied perspectives about what benefit a facilitated workshop can have for farmers. And I think if you can tick all of those different benefits, if there's regulatory advantage, or a commercial advantage, a social advantage, then you will reach more types of farmers. Super. Yeah, thank you everybody. I'm happy to stay online for a little bit if anyone wants to ask me anything.